For China, the US is the biggest threat. A powerful force right at its doorstep. Trying to keep up, China has teamed up with Russia, but instead of getting stronger, they've both ended up more isolated. Meanwhile, the US has allies around the world and the power to project its strength anywhere it wants. So what makes China and Russia so terrified to take on America? Let's break down exactly why they know they can't win, starting with a closer look at their militaries, economies, and strategies, and why the US remains the world's strongest power. We'll start with perhaps the most obvious difference between the three countries, their military expenditure and budget. According to most recent statistics, the US military budget for 2023 was around $916 billion. Compare that to the Chinese, or more precisely, the Chinese Communist Party Military, or PLA, People's Liberation Army, which had a 2023 budget of roughly $296 billion. This means that the US is spending more than 3 times more on its national defense systems than China. In fact, the US military spending is close to 40% of worldwide national defense budgets, with China in second place with around 13% of global spending. And Russia is even more disadvantaged. If we discount the demands of the war in Ukraine, the 2021 military budget for Russia was around $66 billion. In recent years, this has practically doubled. The increase in Russia's budget could be explained by Russia's funneling significantly more resources into the war. This is also indicative of what might happen to both the US and China in a theoretical conflict. For reference, the military budgets of the countries are only fractions of their respective economies, measured in GDP or gross domestic product. The US spends around 3.5% of its GDP on national defense, which is a relatively high percentage in the Western world. In contrast, China spends roughly 1.6% of its GDP on defense. If China decided to spend as much as the US on its military, it would need to spend close to 5%, which would likely have a negative effect on the rest of its economy. Yet again, Russia is much worse off in this regard. Its 2021 military budget was already at around 3.7% of its GDP. With the budget being doubled and the economy taking a hit due to Western sanctions, the percentage skyrocketed to 7%. Even more dangerously for Russia, its 2024 budget announcement estimated that military spending accounted for nearly 40% of its government's total budget. That means that Russia was funneling money into its military at the expense of other sectors, which could have lasting consequences for the country's economy. And even then, the country could barely scrape a portion of what the US or China spent on their militaries. But let's put the budgets in a more historical perspective. Between the end of the Cold War in 1991 and 2021, the United States spent $19 trillion on national defense. This spending is $16 trillion more than what China spent, and nearly as much of the rest of the world's combined expenditure over the same period. The stark difference between the US spending and China's signifies how much of a head start the US has actually had on the military stage for the past 30 or even 60 years. This contrast is exemplified by the scale of the technological advancements in the US military, or more precisely by how little China has managed to catch up, despite desperate attempts to do so. Let's look at some of the key examples of military power projection, mainly in the naval and air forces of both countries. The US Air Force has arguably the biggest fleet of fighter-type aircraft in the world. It mainly uses what are commonly considered fifth-generation aircraft such as the F-22s and F-35s, which have been in service since 2005 and 2015 respectively. However, it also has a considerable number of older fourth-generation aircraft in F-16Cs, which are being made obsolete by newer designs. On the other hand, China started the 21st century with mostly second-generation aircraft from the Soviet Union, and it's replaced them with third- and fourth-generation equivalents, namely the Chengdu J-10 by 2017. You'd think progress would follow, but that hasn't been the case. China's so-called fifth-generation J-20 fighter has been plagued by engine troubles and still lacks true stealth, even after multiple redesigns. The engine design had to be replaced at least 4 times, all in an effort to bring the plane in line with the last generation's capabilities. Reportedly, the country's efforts to modernize the J-20 were advanced by shuttling a fallen F-117, a third-generation US stealth attack aircraft, from Kosovo and stealing information related to the development of the F-35 in the early 2000s. There's a lot more that the J-20 lacks to make it even a solid fifth-generation fighter, comparable to the F-22. As a result, Chinese fighter airplane technology is about 15 to 20 years behind that of the US. Even more important is the fact that the US Air Force projects its military power perilously close to the Chinese border. This is due to the US maintaining over 750 military bases in more than 80 countries worldwide. In particular, the US military stations over 50,000 troops in Japan alone, which maintains direct control over vital islands in the East China Sea. Additionally, US military bases are scattered around the South China Sea, namely close to the Strait of Malacca. The strait is a point of contention for the Chinese economy, as most of its naval trade with Europe, the Middle East, and Africa has to pass there. The US Air Force and Navy have basically projected their power directly against the Chinese claims in those two seas. This is mainly to create a separation between mainland China and Taiwan, a country that China has set its eyes on ever since their separation. According to a report from the think tank RAND that compares the US and Chinese military efficacy, two possible scenarios might happen if the US and China go to war. The first is that the bulk of combat happens around the Strait of Taiwan and therefore closer to mainland China. The other is that first strikes would happen around the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea or off the Japanese archipelago, with Okinawa being a large airport for American use in the East China Sea, with the former option being the one considered for examination. In either scenario, however, RAND predicts that the US Air Force, with its better stealth technology and a larger arsenal of fighter and multi-role aircraft, can effectively enforce air superiority over Chinese waters. The air superiority would lessen as the conflict approaches or goes into the Chinese mainland. But the US Air Force has a different trick up its sleeve for mainland fighting: stealth bombers. The US stealth bomber technology, particularly in the B-1B and B-2 models, is practically unparalleled in the world. This is further enhanced by the US possessing perhaps the most advanced piercing bombs, such as the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators, or MOPS, a 30,000-pound bomb that can punch through as much as 60 feet of reinforced concrete. Even the MOPS' smaller cousins, the 2,000-pound BLU-109 and the 5,000-pound GBU-72, have been enhanced with smart guidance and positioning systems, which allow them to function relatively independently from the bomber. When combined, the US Air Force can send the bombers perhaps thousands of miles inland and then deploy smart bombs that directly target reinforced bunkers to decimate the enemy's weapon supplies, military bases, or vital command centers. Even in the Spratly scenario, the presence of bombers becomes even more effective, as the primary targets will be coastal and unlikely to be as well protected by layered defenses as inland ones. The US Air Force is also on the brink of deploying the world's first sixth-generation aircraft. The Northrop Grumman B-21 Raider had a debut flight in 2023. The aircraft should have significantly higher operational capacity compared to its predecessors, while also being cheaper to maintain. This has led to the US military ordering at least 100 of these aircraft, with options of using more than 200. The aircraft is slated to enter military service by 2027, after which it will start replacing all current bombers that the USAF uses. With the reduced cost, the country's fleet of bomber aircraft might actually grow over the coming decades, while also getting technologically improved in the process. There's another aspect of the stealth bombers and their explosive payloads that can directly endanger both China and Russia. Bombers can be used to disable both countries' nuclear missiles and warhead silos without the US using its own nuclear supplies. For reference, the Cold War brought a proliferation of nuclear warheads to both the US and the then Soviet Union. In the years after the Cold War, the US and Russia steadily reduced their supplies of deployed nuclear warheads. Modern estimates suggest that both countries kept around 1,700 nuclear missiles in active deployment and another 2,000 to 4,000 nuclear warheads in storage, depending on how quickly they're being retired. China, on the other hand, only has about 400 warheads, with approximately 24 deployed on intercontinental missiles and at heavy bomber bases, according to the Federation of American Scientists. Why is this important? Because while both China and Russia possess significant nuclear stockpiles, the vast majority of their warheads remain stored rather than actively deployed. The UN Institute for Disarmament Research and the Federation of American Scientists indicate that Russia stores most of its land-based missiles and warheads in underground bunkers, particularly on the Kola Peninsula and near major population centers in the European part of the country. Considering that the US is an active NATO member, the US Air Force could feasibly leverage this alliance to shuttle its bomber aircraft directly to the NATO-Russia border in Eastern or Northern Europe. From there, the nuclear silos are easy to reach, effectively bypassing the entire Arctic Ocean, which is another possible entry point. The US might not even need to use bombers for that purpose. Tomahawk and JASSM, or Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missiles, of which the US and its allies are estimated to have a collective supply of around 7,500, are considered enough conventional firepower to overwhelm China and Russia's deterrence. In more recent years, the US has also developed the Rapid Dragon deployment system to emphasize its long-distance penetrative ability. The system allows unmodified transport aircraft not only to carry but to also deploy cruise missiles, effectively turning them into air-to-surface bombers. With transport aircraft having significantly more carrying capacity than bombers, this also means that the US Air Force's ability to deploy simultaneous cruise missiles and bomb strikes can skyrocket over the next few years. Both the B-52 bomber and the recent Rapid Dragon system are also capable of deploying nuclear missiles, meaning that the US can also launch a nuclear-first strike. This is incredibly unlikely, as various policies made over the past 40 years were precisely to curb the production and deployment of nuclear weapons. However, both the US and Russia have allowed most nuclear agreements to lapse without renewing them, meaning that neither side effectively has any control or oversight of the other's nuclear deployments. This is not a particularly harrowing concept for the US as it might first appear. Remember, the US still has the capacity to launch conventional strikes that could disable Russian nuclear launch sites. The reverse is unlikely to happen, since the US has stored its warheads much deeper inland and Russia doesn't have comparable stealth capacities. Its only solution would be intercontinental ballistic missiles, which would likely be detected 10 minutes after firing. Furthermore, with Russia's military progress waning, the war in Ukraine has practically reversed the country's ability to project geopolitical and military influence outward. The scale of the Western sanctions that started in 2022 has caused Russia to rely economically on China to the extent that it was estimated that China accounted for more than a third of Russia's exports. This means that Russia will likely need to follow China's lead, which has nowhere near the nuclear capability or defense capacity of the US. Even beyond the US Air Force presence, the US Navy is still likely years ahead of China as well. Most notable is the fact that the US has 11 aircraft carriers while China has only 2. This allows the US Navy and Air Force to mount devastating attacks closer to China's waters than the latter would be able to repel. Additionally, the most recently developed Chinese aircraft carrier, the Fujian, is considered to be a bust in terms of offensive, defensive, and strategic capabilities compared to the USS Gerald R. Ford. But the war around Taiwan might not need China to use an aircraft carrier in the first place, instead using long-range capabilities in the Chinese Navy to make up the difference. While China is considered to have the largest and perhaps slightly more cost-efficient navy, the US still leads in the number and relevance of major warships. These include destroyers, where the US has roughly 50% more ships to deploy than China, which nonetheless has more lightly armored vessels, which are unlikely to be as suitable in actual coastal and open sea wars as large ships. Additionally, in a hypothetical scenario where the US and Chinese navies face off, the US could call on its allies for assistance. These include both South Korea, which has the 5th strongest navy, and Japan, which ranks 6th among global powers. All three allies could concentrate their efforts on the South or East China Sea, creating an overwhelming naval force that China won't be able to match. The littoral or coastal war between China and the US is further in favor of the US due to its ongoing efforts to modernize the Marine Corps. Termed Force Design 2030, the reinvestment and restructuring will potentially refocus the Marines into a fully operational, long-distance, self-sufficient force. This started with the Marine Corps removing tanks, bridging, and even towing artillery from its supplies. Instead, the Marines will be re-equipped and retrained to create makeshift military bases on islands, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. From there on, the Marines will use long-distance missiles and drone technology, the latter of which has advanced by leaps, partially due to the war in Ukraine. This would allow the Marines to become an effective reconnaissance, counterintelligence, and naval deterrence force. As such, the Marines are being repurposed from crisis response to sea denial, which could be construed as a direct counter to China and its efforts to increase its influence through and over the South and East China Seas. The US also still has an insurmountable edge when it comes to anti-surface naval warfare, particularly in terms of using submarines, aircraft, and ships to remove the Chinese amphibious shipping capacity, i.e. sea-to-land transport. The aforementioned study by RAND showed that China has managed to reduce its detriment in this category, but only due to practically doubling the number of ships it operates between 1996 and 2017. This means that the destructive capacity of the US is reduced solely by it having that many more targets. Still, RAND posited that even at these numbers, the US could remove roughly 40% of China's fleet in as little as 7 days. They would also cripple China's ability to both conduct littoral campaigns and resupply its vessels in open sea. There's another key aspect that would be equally as important in giving the US the edge over China: experience. Throughout and after the Cold War, the US and NATO leveraged their militaries by using them in missions abroad. Conflicts such as the War on Terror, which lasted for 20 years in total, allowed the US and its allies to use their military developments in real-life campaigns and restructure and modify their operational capacities in response to actual combat situations. The Russian involvement in international conflict, especially after the Cold War, was typically relegated to sending long-range strikes or selling weapons to one of the participants. Russia gained only limited actual combat experience by using its troops to repel insurgencies in former Soviet countries such as Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Moldova, and Ukraine. For most of these events, Russia had a definitive numerical and technological advantage. In addition, Russia was fighting conflicts against people who were brought up by the Soviet military doctrine and who used Soviet weaponry. This allowed Russia unparalleled insight into both the strategy and technological capacity of its opponent. In contrast, the last time China was in a war was the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979, more than 45 years ago. This means that there are few leftovers of tactics and personnel that were involved in that war, informing China's current military policy and training. Thus, the US has actually battle-tested its tactics and equipment in more ways than one. The military complex's technological progress is built on its successes and failures in real-world scenarios. China and Russia could only use purely theoretical testing and simulations, especially against similarly competent opponents. The US is also not going to enter a conflict against China or Russia alone. Specifically, there's the NATO alliance on the west bordering Russia. If we combine NATO countries excluding the US, their militaries will likely rank the second best and largest in the world, with roughly 2 million active members and a yearly budget of around $300 billion. Additionally, France and the UK, both NATO members, have their own nuclear weapons supplies and deterrent systems. Countries like Germany, the UK and France are also significant arms developers, with military technology on par with the US. NATO countries also frequently have US-born equipment shortly after it's deployed by the US itself. To the east, the US is also a member of the Quad, Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, alongside Japan, Australia, and India. India's membership is a bit dubious, as the country is also a member of BRICS alongside China and Russia, but India and China have frequently clashed over foreign policy and territorial claims in the Himalayas. Apart from that, Japan and Australia also rank high in military presence, as we've mentioned, Japan having the 6th largest navy in the world. South Korea is also a vital US ally, particularly in the ongoing dispute with North Korea, which is, coincidentally, propped up by China and Russia. The American web of alliances means that an offensive move by China or Russia would likely spiral into a conflict spanning dozens of countries and at least 3 continents, which might rapidly devolve into the next World War. Furthermore, there's the question of recent American foreign policy choices, which can change depending on which party and president is in office. A sharp contrast exists between the administration of the 45th President Trump in 2017 to 2020 and the administration of the 46th President Joe Biden from 2021 to 24. Trump in particular was somewhat of a polarizing presence on the global stage, as his administration sometimes went directly against the president's actions. Most notably, Trump frequently held a favorable view of authoritarian countries such as Russia and North Korea. In the latter's case, Trump went so far as to become the first US president to step foot in North Korea. However, this came after North Korea started testing its nuclear weapons capabilities, which prompted an entirely different response, that the US would meet any direct threat with immediate military action. With Russia, Trump was somewhat moderate with his dealings, which led many to suggest the two colluded to help the other in their respective elections. Despite the friendly demeanors, the US enforced several rounds of sanctions against Russia. Geopolitically, Trump has also been critical of NATO countries that spend significantly less on national defense than the US, comparatively in accordance with GDP. The spending situation changed only after 2021, when most NATO members started boosting their military budgets toward the recommended 2% of GDP minimum. Conversely, the Biden administration turned more toward maintaining its existing alliances, particularly with NATO, Israel, and South Korea. Even more importantly, Biden's administration was pivotal in implementing significant checks to China's ability to import technology and gain leverage and funding by exporting metals and chemicals abroad, particularly to Latin America and Russia. When combined, those 8 years allowed the US administration to gain valuable experience in rerouting and maintaining its alliances. With NATO cutting most of its ties to Russia through economic sanctions and cessation of gas and oil imports, there were fewer discrepancies between previous Trump-centric statements and the US foreign policy. This may mean the US wouldn't leave the alliance anytime soon, considering that NATO has become more pivotal in maintaining order in Eastern Europe than ever. Regardless of which party is at the helm of the US, there are more than enough reasons for the country to maintain its course on securing its existing alliances and shunning China and Russia. And with economic measures in place to prevent technology exports, China and Russia are likely to continue to lag, with the gap between them and the US in terms of military technology widening over the next decades. The US implementing brand new technologies and learning from examples, both in the Middle East from the early 2000s onwards, as well as the ongoing developments of drone warfare in Ukraine, means that it's more ready than ever to defend democracy worldwide. But what do you think? Will China and Russia get bold and declare war on the US in the near future? Let us know in the comments section, and thank you for watching. Now go and check out if the US and China go to war, who loses, hour by hour, or click this other video instead.